this is one of my dear friends. And he is a life canon of Grace Cathedral. He is a priest of the Diocese of California. He is very, very entwined into the history of the cathedral and in the history of the diocese and in the history of Episcopal schools in the Episcopal Church and in the organization that serves all of the Episcopal schools. So he's made a gigantic impact across a wide variety of institutions of the Church and civil society as well. And so I thought we need to talk to David about the history with the cathedral as we're embarking on a new period for the cathedral under a new dean. And what does the tradition, the lived tradition in David Forbes' life, what will that give us as the substrate, as the foundation for the new? What was formative for you? In other words, what really, if you look at these amazing accomplishments of yours, and the biggest accomplishment being the formation of a soul, your own spirit, what were the things that you would say were most powerful in shaping you?
People, of course.
Yeah.
What else can you say? In Los Gatos, where I ended up at Stanford, we had a marvelous priest who was a real curmudgeon named Stanley Clapton, who had been brought up in what Anglicans call the liberal Catholic tradition of Bishop Gore and Westcott, and whose heir was William Temple.
Right.
I had studied geology and gotten my master's degree in geology, and I was going to go off and study glaciers somewhere or another, but that was a bit too icy for me by the time I got around to looking at both where my mind and heart were in terms of my theology, my belief, but also in terms of the social justice issues. I was going to be the new chaplain at Stanford in 10 years. That was the romance. I came here to see Bishop Block, and I was in this office, and he spent 15 minutes telling me why I shouldn't do this. But of course, he loved doing this, so he convinced me quite the opposite.
Yeah.
Sent me to Virginia, just like that. He called, picked up the phone and said, "I have a student for you." They said, "Of course, Bishop." So
it's a little different now.
A little different now. Yes, it's very different now. So I went to Virginia, and at Virginia, with a science background, I was confronted with the perfect match of people like Paul Tillich and Cliff Stanley, who was our...
Molligen was teaching Tillich.
And Andrew Molligen was the teacher, and he was my idol, he was my advisor. At the same time, there was Stanley Brown Sermon, who was of the William Temple School, who was still our dean at the time. So it was an amazingly stimulating kind of place to be in the early 50s.
Then, after seminary?
Then they wanted me to come and be an instructor in history, and Bishop Block said, "You can't steal him away from me, I'm putting him at the cathedral."
Wow.
Well, the cathedral at the time was not what it is now. It was half completed.
Right.
And it was, had one priest on the staff, no dean. Bishop Block was carrying on the romance, and he could be both the dean and the bishop of a diocese stretching all the way below San Luis Obispo.
Wow.
Not successfully.
Right.
But a remarkable priest who's here, whose name was Eric Montezambert, who ran the West Coast equivalent of the school of the College of Preachers. It was called the School of the Prophets.
Which was in this building that no longer exists.
Yeah, that's right.
So where the great steps are now, there was this building.
Yeah, which was originally the Church Divinity School of the Pacific.
Right. Second home.
The second home, yes. But so it was a great old building in which I holed myself up as a bachelor. And
oh, you lived there?
I had to live there. That was part of my $2,300 salary.
Was a living.
Was the living, plus kitchen privileges, you understand. And I came as curate.
To the priest.
To work with Eric Montezambert. He called me once the green thing crawling upon the earth. His term for deacon. So the cathedral, in one sense, was functioning very well. Congregations were full. stewardship was good, but it was not. It was
interesting.
It was kind of
quiescent
It was
period.
parochial.
Yeah,
There
and it was parochial.
There was not
more
much,
closed in on itself.
Yeah, not much sense of city ministry. So I think Bishop knew that, and he was ready for a new dean. And so I suggested Julian Bartlett, whom I had worked with.
You did?
Yeah, I'd worked with him in field work.
I had no idea.
And Bishop Locke said, well, who's he? And I said, well, he knows
Where was he?
He was at St. Paul's Rock Creek in Washington, D.C. Okay. And so I said, well, he knows your brother. Oh, said the bishop. So the bishop, who he did know his brother very well. So he got on the phone with his brother, and his brother went on about half an hour and hung up, said,
about how great Julian...
He's our dean.
That's great.
So he called Julian out, and Julian we loved each other, we worked together well, so he said, sure, I'll come. The issue was, how were we going to organize a cathedral? And if we were going to be a cathedral, then we needed to begin to act more like a cathedral.
Interesting. What did that mean?
It meant structure, for one thing. He came in 1955, and Bishop Locke was already getting ready to retire, and we were therefore beginning the search process for a new bishop. And one of the prominent candidates was going to be Jim Pike.
Right.
So he sent me back to New York, Julian Bartlett did, to spend a week at the cathedral, and
where he was the dean.
Where he was the dean, and the celebrated dean already. So I went back there and spent the week there and looked at their structures and their school, which we already were dreaming about here.
When did you start the school?
So we had this dream about a school in the 1950s, and education was in a huge ferment in those days, in the public schools as well as in the church, thinking about what we might contribute to education that was enriching and foundational.
Right.
Really.
What could we offer?
What could we offer that would be something that the community would benefit from, not just a few children? And I was very much caught up in that. I'm a fourth generation educator in my own family, so it was sort of in the genes. I almost didn't realize it. But so we wanted to do that. There were a group of parents in the school who, rather in the community, who were very dissatisfied with the options here. They felt there was, so the idea of a humane educational process. And then in addition to that, functionally the cathedral was getting desperate for a way of maintaining its boys' choir. And so Richard Purvis, who was our celebrated director of music at the time, was very supportive of our doing this. But we did not want to build a choir school. We thought that was entirely too limiting.
Focused just on the choir.
Focused on the choir, which would be like, say, a school at St. Thomas in New York, where there were 30, 40, 50 kids, I'm not sure. And certainly not a boarding school. So we created a cathedral school, and it has, to this day, its motto is minds, hearts, hands, and voices, which are all very significant. Heart for where your faith foundations are. Mind, because if you don't have developing your mind to the best, then you're wasting your talents. Hands, because you need to be as a Christian or as a man of faith.
Of service.
Of service. And voices, so you can sing.
I love it.
And singing is, to me, is not just a nice thing to do. Singing is part of who it is to be a human being.
It shapes us.
It's poetic.
It really is. And it's vibrational between people.
Absolutely,
you can actually feel that.
And it's fascinating, the cathedral school, which is now a school with a remarkable athletic program, wins championships and everything, the boys in that school still look up to the kids in the choir, which for a boys' school says a lot.
It's remarkable.
Says a lot about the whole environment in which that happens.
Humane is the word, I think.
Humane is the word. One of the best things I've ever heard is that secondary school people say about cathedral school kids, they're nice.
They're nice, very
they're
nice people. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? After I spent a short time as interim at St. Paul's Church in Oakland, I came back over to the cathedral and spent the next 8 or 9 years doing AIDS ministry with Anthony, who had started out as a layperson, but by the end of the decade had become a deacon, and a remarkable man who himself, was director of the AIDS quilt. But we did AIDS support ministries and had to sit by and watch our support group members die one by one by one.
The Men of Grace was part of that.
Men of Grace was decimated by it. The cathedral has, to some extent, I think, been an unsung hero as a cathedral in the LGBT community. But there are plenty of people who know there's a place they can come and be comfortable.
I think that's very true.
I think so. I think that the cathedral is simply known as a friend to the LGBT community. The big AIDS celebration, AIDS Day celebrations were here in my time in the 90s. The Gay Men's Chorus came and sang here year after year. Year after year we hung the quilts, quilt panels in the cathedral for that month. It's just a place that is known in the city, so I think it really did enlarge our
and of course
events.
It's an establishment, at one level it's an establishment institution, and for such a prominent institution to take such a bold, loving, compassionate stand with AIDS victims, I think said a lot to the city.
It did. Alan Jones came in 1985, I think, and a stranger to this. But he
walked into it.
Walked into it, and with Fran Tornquist, whom you mentioned, who was so important.
She was really on the ground.
She was on the ground and so supportive. But I think there's something profound about that, about the cathedral's sense of what its ministry needs to be, because it is an establishment, looks so established.
It does.
And it's sitting in the most establishment part of the city.
And many establishment people have been associated with it.
Yes, thank goodness.
Yeah, to our benefit.
To our benefit. And you think about our present trustees and how supportive they are of the larger ministry of this place.
Yeah.
Even of you in your most radical moments.
I know, they've been really amazing.
They have.
They have.
And which is why we have the dean we do.
It is why.
Exactly why we have the dean we do. But, but what I want to say about it is that I think the cathedral has at all costs to avoid being paternalistic, being seen as up on the hill looking down.
So easy to do that.
So easy to do that because of just just the geography of our place.
Well, in the history of our church.
In the history of our church.
We've been an elite church for most of our history.
Yeah. But my point has always been that Christians live by anamnesis, which means
why don't you define that?
Anamnesis means you look to the past only for the lessons it might have for today and tomorrow.
Yeah.
You don't go back to live back there.
No, you bring it into the present and see how it interacts with the present.
Discard what does no longer apply and see how it leads you on.
That's great.
I think that's the Eucharistic principle.
I agree. So what would you say about that? Here we are at this moment. What's worth bringing forward? We've been trying to do that in this conversation. What are the things that you think we need from the past?
I think the missing ingredient that we haven't added is what Alan Jones's primary gift was that he said he did a wonderful prayer, short prayer. I never can remember all of it. It says, "Keep our hearts from growing hard and our sympathies fresh."
Oh, beautiful.
And what he brought was the mandate of civil conversation.
He did. He held to that.
He held that, and Kim Myers, we haven't talked about.
We haven't, and it's an omission. I'm sorry.
It's only a mission because he was a real believer in the future, and he established the think tank, as we called it, the futures tank. Brought in thinkers, secular.
So this was the bishop who followed Bishop Pike.
Yes, in the 1970s.
And just before Bishop Swing.
Bishop Swing. I just want to mention that because, in that sense, Alan Jones picked that up.
Interesting.
But quite independently.
Yeah.
To be Alan being Alan.
Right.
To this day has this passion about, the generosity of God, and let's talk.
Yeah.
Let's talk things out.
And he loves that.
And he loves that, and he's a genius at it. And then he brought that became in the warp and woof of the cathedral.
And became really a hallmark of the cathedral, didn't it?
It did.
What do you want to say to people who are going to be really interested in this about where the church is and where you hope it's going to go?
I don't know about you, but I think that this is a time for for the church to be discerning the right questions.
I agree with that.
The answers are not here yet.
Right.
They're very much not here yet.
We need to see where the right questions are.
And I think the value, the immense value that, probably use that word, that Malcolm Young brings is he's a seeker.
He very much is.
And he's a good listener. And that the cathedral must be a listening post for the city. We know there's wisdom out there.
And we recognize it and honoring it.
We're not the dispensers.
We're not holding it all.
We're not the dispensers.
Right.
But at the same time, we are dispensers of a tradition.
We're in the conversation.
We're in the conversation, and we've got something to say.
With our own contributions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
it's a very horizontal view
very
of spirituality, isn't it?
That's right, even though we're on a hill.
Yeah.
We wanted a communicator. Someone who didn't communicate as a technique, but someone who would communicate because it's who they are. And who would communicate themselves, not communicate facts or communicate wisdom.
Right.
Unless the wisdom came from within. You know, I think one of the great problems we have in our whole church life today is that we've externalized so much in terms of doctrines or techniques or organizations, when the fact is Christianity is caught, not taught.
Right.
And we wanted somebody who would be contagious.
Yeah.
And you are. And that's, I think, part of being contagious is contagious as a leader, contagious as an embodiment of gospel, good news, one who hasn't stopped learning, one who wants to learn here and not somewhere else, someone whose heart is here and yet is bigger than here, because the cathedral's great danger is, because of its success and its size and all that it can become self-satisfied and ingrown. And we just cannot have that, not in our day and age. The cathedral will die sooner or later and just be an empty stone structure. The job of a dean is so difficult now because, on the one hand, you're expected to be pastor to the staff in a way that a chaplain only can help you. You're called to be chaplain to the city in a way which gets into the relevancies of social issues. At the same time, as Alan Jones so often represented and pointed out, we have to be a center of informed, historically informed and critical conversation. Compassion has got to be absolutely central to the life of this place. And it's got to be exemplified in the dean and exemplified in the staff, exemplified in how the congregation conducts its ministries.
Do you remember the first time you met me? Because I do remember the first time I met you.
Well, I think it was at a clergy conference.
Yeah, it was.
And I was, as usual, trying to do the logistics of the conference and sort of looking out for the newer clergy.
Right.
So I would always keep my eye open for the younger clergy to make sure that they feel included. And there you were.
And David was. David was like the main person who was the older clergy person who paid attention to younger people. So David was the only one who'd always get my name right and really knew who he was talking to too. And yeah, so it would be, it was one of those hot days up in Sonoma County in September, and I had driven up with my friend Bruce O'Neill, and we got there and we checked in, and you're the first person I talked to after we arrived at the ranch, and we talked a little bit about Berkeley and Stanford. You were a mentor to me. I remember talking to you mostly because of schools. You know, David is the founder of the Cathedral School for Boys. You're the founder of St. Paul's Oakland too, right? And then did you serve at St. Andrew Saratoga, or did you just consult with?
No, I served at St. Stephen's.
St. Stephen's, that's right.
And I served at St. Matthew San Mateo.
Right. And see, I'm connected to that school too.
I was an AES consultant.
Well, I was going to say that too. I mean, the National Association of Episcopal Schools, in a way, it was kind of built around you. I mean, you were in place already, and you were part of that founding group of people.
And I was chair of the Division of Schools at the time here. So.
Yeah. Which it would be good to have a Division of Schools again. But so David is a pioneer in Episcopal education, and really, I mean, set up the infrastructure as we know it in Northern California. As soon as I knew that schools was going to be such an important part of my ministry, every time I saw David, I had a list of questions in my mind of things to ask him, like, when do you set up a charter or a constitution for your school? How do you do teacher contracts? Because I was the school head, because it was too small of an organization to have a real person who knew what they were doing. So David and I would consult and work together on school issues having to do with schools. We started a school called Ventana School in Los Altos.
You talk about what the future holds. The cathedral no longer can be the only hands in the community. It has to find partnerships, because there are many hands in San Francisco and in the larger community in the Bay Area trying to do what needs to be done to deal with justice issues and to display the issues of loneliness and companionship. And so the cathedral can be a great leader because it provides, partly because it can provide a reason for this all to be, the theological reasons for it, and a place for people to talk in civic and civil ways about it.
And I just look at the amount of despair. If you just think of all the things you read in the newspaper this week, about the number of the increasing problem people are having with drug addiction, and the increasing number of people who are taking their own lives, with the sense that it's harder to find work that's meaningful for people, that the people are either unable to even find something that can be a contribution to the world. And that kind of spiritual hunger, it's just such a basic part of the human condition. And Grace Cathedral, it exists to address that spiritual hunger.
I think the church is always willy-walled, going back and forth between detachment from and over almost a patriarchal involvement in, and for us to discover our limitations, but to recognize that we have what nobody else has to offer, perhaps, in partnership with the many possible and actual organizations of the city that would love to have us, would love to believe that the church actually was on their side and on humanity's side of the city.
I really hope that you capture what an extraordinary gift David is to the church. He is such a modest person that you're never going to get it from him talking to him directly. And so many of the colleagues who really understand your greatest contributions to the church and the world just aren't with us anymore. I just am lucky that I was the youngest person in the diocese for such a long period of time that I knew those people. And so I know a little bit more about what you've done and the ways that you've blessed us. So that's the most important thing, I think.
Well, the one thing I've never thought that I was the end of the world. I never thought that the Episcopal Church was the end of the world. Not even Grace Cathedral, not even Cathedral School for Boys. That we simply have a role to play, and the great talent is to both know your limitations and know where your niche is and make the most of it.
I'm so glad that we had this chance to talk.
I am too.
Spend some time together.